Hey everyone, I'm going to show you how to take a pretty flat image and turn it into something a bit easier on the eyes to look at here. As you'll notice right away, there's quite a bit of dust in the image. That's because this was shot on my digital medium format back when I owned it. And, well, as you can see, the dust shows up a lot more than on your digital SLR. We'll take care of that near the end. First things first is we always play with the exposure, figure out what we want it to look like for the most part. I generally shoot about half a stop to a stop underexposed just to retain the details in the highlights. So I always play around with the exposure first, and then we move down to our curves. For an image like this, you'll probably want to do a medium or a strong contrast. You can kind of see what it does there. Basically what it's doing is it's just adjusting how sharply it adjusts the curve. So I'm going to start with a medium contrast and play with that. So that's typically what I do to start off my editing. Is just pull up the highlights a bit, bring down the darks and the shadows. And as you can see, the image is quite purple. That's because the Hasselblad that I was shooting on didn't have an auto white balance. So I'm going to bring that down and make it a bit more ocean-like. As you can see there, that's more or less what the scene looked like, but you don't always have to go for exactly what the scene looked like. You can exaggerate the mood using your editing. It's going to make it kind of a turquoise. So now we've got the image looking more or less what the final color will be like, we can start playing around with the curves again. As you can see, the right side of the image is getting quite dark. This is where I'd bring in a gradient filter. Now, one thing that makes playing with gradients easier is setting the exposure to a -4. This allows you to easily see what area the gradient is affecting. You can adjust the gradient by using your mouse on either the top or bottom lines and rotating, grabbing the center line. If you want it to be perfectly straight, you can use the Shift key. So you just want to do the right side of the image. This looks like a pretty good placement. Now bring the exposure up to what we want it to look like. So we've brought it up a stop and a half, and it's looking a lot better. So again, you can see the dust there really showing through now. Add some clarity, and what this does is basically just add some punch to the images. You don't want to go too far or it'll start to look a little bit HDR-esque. I'm liking what it did to the clouds there, so I'm going to create another gradient layer just for the sky, and that's going to be with the clarity. Looks quite a bit better than before. Went from that to that. Now, typically throughout the edit, you can look back and forth and see how the progress is coming along. Pretty good image right there. Now, another area that might be a little bit too bright is the ocean here. So you can actually brush down the exposure. It's similar to the gradient, you just get to choose where you want it. I generally do it with a bit of a feather so it doesn't look too drastic, and about half flow rate. So I find it easier to brush in more. So again, I'm going to keep the exposure at 4, just so you can see what you're doing. You can see that there. That's made it a bit flat, so I'm going to add a bit of contrast. So that's looking quite a bit better now. So we're at about half a stop under and quite a bit more contrast there. You can also play around with the highlights and the shadows, but it doesn't do a whole heck of a lot. So I'd like the sky to be a bit more blue, so we can go back to our gradient filter, and I'm going to add another one. Reset the exposure, and do a local white balance adjustment. And I'm going to bring up the contrast a bit. And once again, I'm going to bring in some more clarity. So the sky is looking pretty much where I want it now. I like this clouds looking quite aggressive and angry. So now we're going to play with the bottom again. I'm going to bring up the exposure a little bit here. Just going to use the brush tool to brush in the exposure. Okay, that looks quite a bit better. You can also turn off the brushes and see what the difference it is. Noticed right up in here that I brushed a bit too much for the underexposure, so I'm going to bring that down, bring that back up a bit. There we go. Now I'm going to make the brush smaller, make a new one. We're going to zoom in here on the crests of the waves and darken those a bit. So just add a bit more depth to the water. Now we can play around with the exposure. Go to the extreme and see exactly what I've brushed in. Obviously don't want it that dark. Just going to go 0.3 below. Now I'd like some more clarity down here in the water as well. So we're going to try a gradient filter on that. So now you can double click on any of these sliders and it'll reset it to where you want it to go. That's a little much there. Bringing the highlights down for the water over here. So now, like we did with the water down here, I'm going to go up into the clouds and brush in the dark areas. Make them pop a little bit more. Now that we've really processed the image, you can see how dirty this sensor really was. So now that I'm happy with the color, you can take a look at the before and after. You can see what a difference a few minutes of editing would make. So now to get rid of these pesky little dust spots, you can use the spot removal tool. And then just zoom in on the area that you'd like to remove the dust. Only going to do the really noticeable ones here. Typically, if I was putting this image into my portfolio, like an edit I did previously, I would take this into Photoshop and remove this hair. Not sure how the hair got on the sensor, but I'd take that out. And now with the clone tool, you can adjust where it's resampling from, in case it doesn't line up perfectly and looks a bit out of place. Like this one here looks a bit odd. There we go. So obviously I'm not going to do all of these because that would take forever, and you get an idea of how you do it. Now the final stage to an image, if you feel like it isn't cropped quite right, you can use the crop tool. On something like this, I would do something like a 16:9 crop, just to get some of that unnecessary foreground out of the way. Then hit enter. And there you go. That's something like the final image would look like. Once again, we have a before and after showing how much of an improvement you can make with your images. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out my other videos coming soon.